It's day 2 of Wilds of Eldraine spoilers, and today we get a look at the best turtle ever and one of the weirdest pre-bannings ever. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Wilds of Eldraine spoilers. So we've reached day 2 of spoiler season, and we still have a ton of cards to talk about. Not as many as yesterday, but we got some really interesting mythics, some weird combo cards, a really spicy new turtle, and a bunch of other stuff as well, which means we should probably jump right into it, start talking about sweet new magic cards. Before we do, a couple of quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can snag them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. And second, to keep up on all the latest spoilers throughout the day, you should mosey on over to MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk some Wilds of Eldraine. First up today, we got the best turtle ever in Blossoming Tortoise. So Blossoming Tortoise, one of the most unique and spiciest cards we've seen from Wilds of Eldraine so far. A 4-mana 3/3 mythic turtle, not a legendary, which is actually notable in 2023, says when it enters a battlefield or attacks, mill 3 cards and return a land card from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Activated abilities on lands you control cost 1 less to activate, and land creatures you control get +1/+1. So on level 1, Blossoming Tortoise is kind of like a Soul of Windgrace. It actually has a very similar ability. When it ETBs or attacks, you get to put a land from your graveyard onto the battlefield tapped. The upside of Blossoming Tortoise is it mills some cards. Soul of Windgrace doesn't do that, so you gotta find a way to get the lands in your graveyard before you play your Soul of Windgrace, like a fetch land or a channel land or whatever, some self-mill. Blossoming Tortoise gets around that by milling, so you should be able to hit a land with the mill even if you don't already have one in your graveyard. The downside though is it is only a 3/3, so I'm not sure how realistic it is to actually like snowball this by attacking. Soul of Windgrace is a 5/4 that can also make itself indestructible, much easier to keep attacking with, to ramp turn after turn. Blossoming Tortoise might be more of like a one-shot where you play it and you get one land and then maybe you get super lucky and can attack, but mostly it sits out on the battlefield and does other sweet things. Speaking of the other sweet things, it has 2 other abilities. The least impactful, I think, is pumping your land creatures. Not an ability we've seen a ton. It was on Sylvan Advocate, although Sylvan Advocate, honestly, it saw a lot of play in Standard, but that was mostly because it became a 2-mana 4/5, which was good enough back in the day, not because it pumped lands, but if you're playing, I don't know, Restless Cottage, Mutavault, maybe you got synergies like Sylvan Awakening to turn all your lands into creatures, Blossoming Tortoise is kind of a lord for your lands. By far the most exciting ability, though, is activated abilities on lands you control cost 1 less to activate. This is notable for 2 really big reasons. So we have several cards in Magic that reduce the cost of activated abilities. However, Blossoming Tortoise does something unique. For one thing, most of the cards that reduce activated ability costs only work on creatures, so they don't work on lands at all. And then even if they work on lands, like Zerta, for example, which works on anything as long as it's not a mana ability, it only reduces the cost down to 1 at the lowest. It can't reduce the cost to 0. Blossoming Tortoise doesn't have that restriction. It can reduce the cost of activated abilities on your lands all the way down to 0 mana, which opens up a bunch of sneaky shenanigans. So in Standard, I'm honestly not sure how much you can do with this. Like, it makes your Mishra's Foundry cheaper to activate, your Mech Hanger cheaper to activate, you can Field of Ruin for 1 mana instead of 2 mana. All that's fine, but not like game-breaking or anything. But once you get back into older formats, there's some really sweet synergies with this card. So maybe the easiest combo is Deserted Temple. Deserted Temple is this weird old land that has an activated ability of 1 mana tap it, untap target land. So if you have Blossoming Tortoise out, Deserted Temple will be 0 mana, tap it to untap target land. So the trick here is you can use Deserted Temple to untap itself. So essentially, with Blossoming Tortoise, Deserted Temple's just tap to untap itself, tap to untap itself. Why would we want to infinitely tap and untap the same land? Well, there's a few ways to combo with this. One is Darksteel Garrison, this weird artifact that kind of enchants a land, but it says whenever the land becomes tapped, target creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn. So if you put Darksteel Garrison on your Deserted Temple and you have a Blossoming Tortoise, you get to make all your creatures infinitely big. You just keep tapping and untapping the Deserted Temple, make your creatures absolutely massive, kill the entire table. There's also some self-mill combos like Chronic Flooding. Enchants a land, says whenever your land becomes tapped, its controller mills the top 3 cards of their library. So if you have this with a Blossoming Tortoise and you put it on the Deserted Temple, you tap and untap, you mill your entire deck, and then win with Thassa's Oracle. Same with Mesmeric Orb. Whenever a permanent becomes untapped, its controller mills a card. Same combo, mill your entire deck with Blossoming Tortoise, Mesmeric Orb, Deserted Temple, win with Thassa's Oracle, Laboratory Maniac, whatever. There's also Wake Thresher, which just cares about permanents being untapped. It gets +1/+1. So you get an infinitely big Wake Thrasher and then attack your opponents, flan at your opponents, whatever. There's also just some general synergies like Cabal Coffers being 1 to activate instead of 2, or Nykthos being 1 to activate instead of 2, lets it make even more mana. There's combos with Mutavault. There's a couple of creatures in Magic, like Crackdown Construct and Ceaseless Searblades, that have abilities that care about abilities being activated. For example, Crackdown Construct says, whenever you activate an ability of an artifact or creature that isn't a mana ability, it gets +1/+1. Ceaseless Searblades, whenever you play an activated ability on an elemental, it gets +1/+0. So the trick is, you got Blossoming Tortoise, you got Mutavault, you turn it into a creature for 0 mana, thanks to Blossoming Tortoise. That counts as activating ability, and then it's going to have all creature types. So it's going to be an elemental for Ceaseless Searblades. So essentially, you just keep paying 0 to repeatedly activate your Mutavault to turn it into a creature again and again and again, which will make the Crackdown Construct or Ceaseless Searblades infinitely powerful to kill your opponents in 1 attack. There's also some really wild synergies with Aboro. The problem with this combo, as much as this is my favorite combo, is it's not really legal anywhere because it involves fast bond, but Aboro's this land that for 1 mana can return itself to its owner's hand. If we got Blossoming Tortoise, it's 0 mana to return a Aboro to its owner's hand, and then Fast Bond lets you play any amount of lands, but you gotta take 1 damage for each one that you play. So the idea would be you play a Aboro, trigger your landfall like Teyova to draw a card and gain a life, Scoot Swarm to make some tokens, then you use Aboro's ability to pick it back up, then you can play it again thanks to Fast Bond, so you end up making infinite mana because Aboro comes into play untapped, you end up getting infinite landfall triggers, but Fast Bond is banned in Commander, so it doesn't actually work in Commander. I guess you can do like a mini version of this by just getting extra land drops with like Azusa or something, but without Fast Bond, I don't think there's any way to go fully infinite with Aboro, but still a really sneaky synergy if you're playing Blossoming Tortoise. There's also just some good ramp options, like the old Odyssey filter lads, like Sungrass Prairie, have an ability that's pay 1, tap it to make 2 mana. Well, if you have Blossoming Tortoise, it's pay 0, tap it to make 2 mana. So these are just untapped lands that tap for 2 mana, like upgraded Ancient Tombs, essentially. So if you're building a Commander deck, that's a really cool way to just power out some big things really fast. It also makes these bad common mana fixing lands, like Hall of Oracles, Guildmage Forum, Cave of Temptation. I guess some of those are rares, but you know what I'm saying. The lands that are pay 1, tap it to make a mana of any color, it turns them into actual City of Brasses, because you pay 0, tap it to make a mana of any color. So then Hall of Oracles or Cave of Temptations just turns into City of Brass or Mana Confluence without having to take any damage. So Blossoming Tortoise, I love this card. I'm not sure this card is actually competitive anywhere. It is a 4-mana 3/3. It does do something when it enters the battlefield that is nice. You get some value out of it even when it dies. I'm not sure how you actually like take advantage of this in competitive formats, but there's just so many sneaky synergies that I can't wait to brew around this card. Even if it's not competitive, it is going to be one of the sweetest against the odds cards from the set, because it just does things that we've never seen a Magic card do before. We've never actually had these effects on a Magic card, which opens up a whole wide range of possibilities. Next up, we got another member of the Mythic Virtue cycle, the white member in Virtue of Loyalty. So the adventure side, 2 mana instant speed, create a 2/2 white knight creature token with vigilance, and then the enchantment side, 5 mana enchantment, says at the beginning of your end step, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control and untap those creatures. So before we talk about this card and its power level, I will say, if you want to discount everything I say about it, that is perfectly fine. I would understand. Last time we were in Eldraine, I was very, very high on another white mythic that was part of a cycle and cared about knights in the Circle of Loyalty, and it turns out the Circle of Loyalty and knights in original Eldraine were like really, really bad. This was like the worst member of its cycle. They had Embercleave and the Great Henge. So if you just want to throw everything I say about this card out the window, because my track record with rating white mythics from cycles in Eldraine that care about knights is not very good, I will completely understand. But I will say, I think Virtue of Loyalty is at least way better than the Circle of Loyalty. If you think about it, making a 2/2 Knight at instant speed for 2 mana, that's not bad. It's kind of like Selesnya Charm, which was a pretty good card back in Standard in its era. Not like super above the curve or whatever, but it gives you some flexibility. The problem with the enchantment side of Virtue of Loyalty is it's a bit expensive. Like Broker's Ascendancy kind of does the same thing for 3 mana. I guess you are in 3 colors, which makes it harder to cast or limits it, but really 5 mana, put a counter on all your stuff, untap your stuff, a little bit more than you'd want to pay. But think of this as kind of like a charm. Like if you just had Virtue of Loyalty, no adventure side, I think the card would be pretty underpowered. If you just had the adventure side with no enchantment side, I think the card would also be pretty underpowered. But when you add those together, it's actually a pretty powerful effect. In the early game, you get a 2/2. Later in the game, you get this enchantment that's growing your team. So this is the kind of card that you could play in essentially any white aggro deck, like Soldiers or Adeline mono white beatdowns. The question is 5 mana just too much for those decks? Even considering you get to make the 2/2 that's gonna get you on the board early in the game, I think there's a couple of really big homes. Even if this card doesn't make it in just generic mono white or Soldiers in Standard, we do have Knight support in Standard. We have Marshal of Zhalfir, so we already have a Night Lord, Invasion of New Phyrexia, flipping into Teferi, which cares about Knights, so maybe Knight Tribal can be a thing in Standard. The other place this seems really interesting is in +1/+1 counter themed decks. We actually have a lot of support for +1/+1 counter shenanigans. We got Ozolith in Standard, Dusk Legion Duelist, Botanical Brawler, and that seems like a nice fit there. In the early game, you get an okay creature, and then later you get this really powerful enchantment that works really well with the plan of your deck. So I'm interested in trying it there at a minimum. As far as Commander is concerned, I think this card is worth considering in basically any +1/+1 counter themed deck. If you think about the history of Magic, there's actually not that many cards that repeatedly every turn put a counter on all your creatures. So if you're playing like Atraxa Proliferate +1/+1 counters, Falco Spara +1/+1 counters, Shalayan Halar +1/+1 counters, I think that Virtual Loyalty is worth it just because Commander's a little bit slower, you get a little more ramp, 5 mana isn't the end of the world, triggering on your end step is big because even if stuff gets blown up, it's at least going to trigger once most likely. So I think in any +1/+1 counter deck in Commander, the card is at least worth considering, and it might end up being pretty good. So Virtue of Loyalty, it's no Circle of Loyalty, but it seems like a pretty powerful card that has a chance in Standard and definitely in Commander. We also got a wacky legendary artifact in Agatha's Soul Cauldron. So 2 mana, legendary artifact, it says you can spend mana as well as mana of any color to activate the abilities on creatures you control. Creatures you control with +1/+1 counters on them have all activated abilities of all creature cards exiled with Agatha's Soul Cauldron, and then you can tap it to exile target creature from a graveyard, and when a creature is exiled this way, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. So Agatha's Soul Cauldron, it's essentially like a weird experiment crash, kind of calls back a little bit to like Necrotic Ooze, where you're able to give abilities to your other creatures by getting things in the graveyard and then exiling them, getting counters on your team. What exactly you do with this card, I'm not exactly sure. So we were talking yesterday about Agatha the Vile Cauldron, and these cards obviously are supposed to work together. They even got the same name. We also have Tazari in Standard, so you can see the pieces for some really weird activated ability deck. I have no idea what to do with it, though. Like, yes, it's cool that Agatha Soul Cauldron lets you activate Tazari with any colors of mana, lets you activate Agatha with any colors of mana, lets you move abilities around by exiling stuff from the graveyard. It's even graveyard hate if you gotta get rid of an Atraxa or something from your opponent's deck. How this deck actually plays out, I have no idea. I feel like this is a deck that's really complicated and going to be tricky to build, but if we can figure it out, it could be really powerful. So if you have some ideas of how to actually brew this and make it a real deck in Standard, definitely let me know in the comments, because I definitely want to try to build this deck. I just not exactly sure what the payoff is. If you think about Agatha Soul Cauldron, one of the nice aspects about it is graveyard hate. Just tap to exile target card from a graveyard. That's worse than Unlicensed Hearse. So in a generic deck, you're not going to play this over Hearse, but if you can take advantage of its other abilities, it is a nice little upside that if your opponent goes to like reanimate their Atraxa with Cruelty of Gix, Agatha Soul Cauldron just says no by exiling the Atraxa. As far as activated abilities in Standard, I was thinking, okay, like, is there any way this is worth it just to steal abilities from creatures that are naturally going to end up in the graveyard? Like, what if you don't build around this? Can you still get value out of it? And the answer is Probably not really. Like, you can steal Gix's ability, I guess, and discard a bunch of cards. Lauren, you can tap to let everyone draw a card. You can get a Skrelv or a Skystrike Officer, a Catilda, or a Misery Shadow. But in reality, I don't think there's enough heavily played activated abilities that you could just play this card as a generic card and be like, okay, I'm going to just steal abilities from what my opponent's playing, and it's going to be powerful. I don't think that's going to be good enough, so I do think you have to build around it. There is some synergy with certain combos, like Horseshoe Crab is a card that works really well with Agatha's Soul Cauldron. It's just 1 mana untap Horseshoe Crab, so if you can like give that ability to something like Fabro Elder, you can tap it to make a bunch of mana, untap it using the Horseshoe Crab ability, do it again, make infinite mana. So that's one example of like a pretty easy infinite combo with this card, and I'm sure there are many others like that as well. I've seen people talking about using this with Grist, and I don't think this is actually like a good combo, but it is a hilarious combo. So Grist, if it isn't on the battlefield, is a 1/1 insect, so it's a creature as far as Agatha's Soul Cauldron is concerned, and loyalty abilities are actually activated abilities. So if you can get a Grist in your graveyard, you can take and exile it with Agatha's Soul Cauldron and give all your creatures with counters Grist's loyalty abilities. And the most hilarious thing to do with it is play something that puts counters on creatures as they come into play, like Tribute to the World Tree. And then what you can do is Agatha's Soul Cauldron to make your thing into a Grist. You use your creature that now has Grist's loyalty ability to +1 to make an insect token. That insect is going to come into play. It's going to get counters thanks to Tribute to World Tree. So now it'll have all the abilities of Grist, and then that insect can +1 to make another insect and mill some cards, and that'll get counters. So essentially you make a huge board of insects and mill most or all of your deck. I don't know if this is actually something that would be competitive, but it does sound absolutely hilarious. I've also seen people talking about using it in like Yawgmoth maybe in Modern, where you can give your Stranglegeist or Young Wolf Yawgmoth's ability. I guess that deck also has Grist, so maybe somehow you can also do the Grist trick in a Yawgmoth deck. It could also work in like a Ravager Hardened Scales Shell, where Arcbound Ravager has a really powerful activated ability where you're sacking stuff all the time, so you're getting stuff in the graveyard. Being able to make everything into a Ravager seems like it could be pretty powerful. So Agatha's Soul Cauldron might have some possibilities in formats like Modern. I think for sure, though, it's going to work really well in some commander decks. If your commander is about activated abilities, this seems like a pretty sweet option. Even just fixing your mana for Tazri or Sisay or Kenrith, being able to pay any mana to activate them rather than pay the specific colors of mana, that's really powerful. It can work well in +1/+1 counter themed decks. Nigila, for example, Marcel, for example, Magus Lucia Kane seems like another sweet option. So if your commander is about activated abilities, then I think this is a really sweet option for your deck, and it has some upside in +1/+1 counter decks too. So Agatha's Soul Cauldron, another card that I really love. I'm not sure how good it is. I'm not sure exactly all the things we can do with it, but it's super unique, and it seems like it has some really interesting combo potential. Moving into the world of rares, we have Thunderous Debut, which at 8 mana might not be as much of a bargain as its name suggests. So Thunderous Debut, 8 mana green sorcery. Look at the top 20 cards of your library. You can reveal up to 2 creature cards from among them. If the spell was bargain, put the cards onto the battlefield. Otherwise, put the revealed cards in your hand and then shuffle. So I have to say, 20 cards deep is weird to me. I guess that gives it some potential of whiffing, but having to count out 20 cards in paper is a little annoying. It made me wonder if they could just make it like, search your library for 2 cards and put them into play. Because when I first saw this, I was like, okay, this is like a new take on Tooth and Nail. But then the more I thought about it, kind of it's actually not. Like, going 20 cards deep, even in a 60 card format, you might not hit what you want, especially if you're only playing like one-ofs of your finishers. And in Commander, going 20 cards deep, you're definitely having a huge risk of not finding what you want. So it's kind of like a Tooth and Nail, except it whiffs sometime, I guess, tooth and fail, so to speak. So I guess maybe it's actually like the world's biggest collected company. It's a collected company with no mana value restriction that goes super deep in your deck, but it still costs costs 8 mana, which is a ton, and I gotta say I'm a little skeptical this card will actually see that much play, especially outside of Standard, because we have cards like See the Unwritten, we have cards like Tooth and Nail, and these cards just really don't show up anymore. Like, if you're playing Modern or Historic, you can just Tooth and Nail for a single mana more, and get exactly the 2 cards you want on the battlefield, with no bargaining, no sacrificing anything. See the Unwritten goes 8 cards deep, grabs 2 creatures if you have Ferocious, so I'm actually not sure this card can see play outside of Standard. In Standard, it could be pretty sweet in some sort of ramp deck. We've seen recently people playing this Simic ramp deck, where you're like using Topiary Stomper and Azusa's Many Journeys to ramp into Titan Industry, Hullbreak or Atraxas Praetor's Voice. Like, if you're playing a bunch of these big finishers and can ramp into Thunderous Debut, it seems pretty powerful. Like, get a Titan of Industry and an Atraxa for 8 mana, that's a pretty good deal. The problem is, what are you going to sacrifice? How are you going to have that artifact, enchantment, or token to sacrifice? And I was looking through, like, the most common builds of Simic ramp in Standard, and the answer is, you probably don't. I guess you have Azusa's Many Journeys, but that's not enough by itself. However, if you switch up your ramp package, it is pretty easy to turn on Bargain. Like, Blighted Burgeoning is just a 3 mana ramp spell that enchants a land, makes it tap for 2 mana, and it incubates, so it gives you a random token to sacrifice. Or like Scout the Wilderness, you can do some ramping and make some tokens. Weather Seed Treaty makes a token, does some ramping, plus you can always play more Myrixes or Argoths just to get tokens on the battlefield. So it doesn't seem unrealistic to me that you could build a pretty powerful version of the Simic ramp deck that is constantly going to be able to bargain thanks to these cards, and then I think it could actually be pretty good. Like I said though, once you get outside of Standard, this card really loses its appeal to me, just because there's better options. Like I said, Tooth and Nail, See the Unwritten, Summoning Trap, and if you're playing Commander, like, you can play it for fun for sure, but just be warned, in a singleton format with 100 card decks, 20 cards is definitely not Tooth and Nail. Much of the time you are not going to hit the best card that you want with this, which really does give it a pretty high fail rate. So I think Thunderous Debut, I like the callback to Tooth and Nail. It looks a little bit like a super iconic card from 20 years ago, but I think in practice it's a lot worse, which probably just limits its potential to Standard. We also got, pretty spicy one, in Lord Skitter's Blessing. So 2 mana enchantment. When it ETBs, you create a Wicked Roll token attached to target creature you control. So it gives the enchanted creature +1/+1, and when the aura goes to the graveyard, each opponent loses a life. And then it says at the beginning of your draw step, if you control an enchanted creature, you lose 1 life and you draw an additional card. So Lord Skitter's Blessing, it's literally Phyrexian Arena, with the downside that you need an enchanted creature on the battlefield for it to work, but the upside that it makes an aura that gives your creature +1/+1 when it ETBs. I'm very curious to see how good this card's gonna be. It is very competitively costed, and in Commander, I'm a big believer in Phyrexian Arena. I still play it in all my decks. I know it's kind of fallen out of favor. In Standard, I'm a little bit more skeptical. I really was hyped for Phyrexian Arena in Standard when they reprinted it, and I started playing it, and I found that I got wrecked by Shieldred too often. Like, losing 1 life to draw a card to Arena, that's perfectly fine, I can deal with that. But when it's actually 3 life because of Shieldred, and then you're also taking 2 in your draw step because of Shieldred, you just lose life way too fast. And when Shieldred in like almost 60% of decks in Standard, it's a really, really tough sell to play a card like Lord Skitter's Blessing. And once you get outside of Standard, you got Shieldred, but also Orcish Bowmasters to punish you for drawing cards like this. The other thing to keep in mind with Lord Skitter's Blessing is if you want the Wicked Roll to work, you need a creature on the battlefield. So I'm not sure how often you're going to be able to play this on turn 2. The dream is 1-drop into Lord Skitter's Blessing, put the aura on the 1-drop, start getting in for extra damage, start drawing extra cards. But when that doesn't happen, or the 1-drop dies, then all of a sudden, your Lord Skitter's Blessing isn't really doing anything until you get another enchanted creature. So it might be specifically for decks that are built around the auras theme, like straight up roll decks or auras themed decks, because the risk of having that 1-drop just get killed is going to be pretty high. So unless you have other ways of getting auras on creatures, it's going to be a Phyrexian Arena that doesn't work all the time. I do really like it in Ariat decks. That's probably the best home for it. We were talking yesterday about how Ariat is one of my favorite cards we've seen from this set so far, and Ariat just wants you to put as many auras on the battlefield as possible. And if you have Ariat out, the life gain and drain you're going to get from Ariat is going to help undo the life loss from Lord Skitter's Blessing, or even having like a Shieldred on the battlefield. So I think it's a super easy inclusion in something like Area, in something where you're really built around getting auras on the battlefield. There maybe is an argument for playing it in the sideboard in Auras decks in older formats. At 2 mana, it is cheap enough that it works with Loris, which is a big deal in like Historic and specific. Is it necessary when you have Throm and Core Spirit Dancer and all these sources of card advantage? I don't know. I'm not sure if it solves any of the issues that the Aura deck has. The problem with the Aura deck is if your opponent can just kill all your creatures, your deck doesn't really do anything. Lord Skitter's Blessing is another card that to really do anything, it needs creatures on the battlefield. Because if you don't have that enchanted creature, it's not going to draw you any extra cards. So it might be another card that just kind of has the same issues as the rest of the deck, rather than a card that solves the problem of the deck. But the fact that it's cheap enough to work with Loris in a format like Historic is notable for sure. I think one place I would play this very consistently is an Aura-based commander deck. So the first one I thought of is Earth Enchanter. Xur can tutor this out. Like I said, I love Phyrexian Arena in Commander, and if you're playing a deck that's built around auras, and you're mostly always going to have an enchanted creature on the battlefield, then this is just a cheaper Phyrexian Arena with upside. So Xur can tutor it out, maybe Killian or Athena cares about enchantments, Gen or Tetsunari. So in a deck like that, this is potentially a less consistent but even cheaper Phyrexian Arena with the upside of supporting some of your synergies by putting that role on the battlefield. So Lord Skitter's Blessing, it's so cheap that I think it's worth keeping in mind. I'm curious to see how good this card is. Like, is it too inconsistent? Does it line up too poorly with Shieldred and Bowmasters for 60 card formats? There's certainly concerns there, but 2 mana, put an aura on the battlefield, draw some extra cards. We have some decks that could really take advantage of this, so it's going to be very interesting to see how it shakes out. We also got Farsight Ritual, which 4 mana instant. It is bargain. Look at the top 4 cards of your library. If it was bargain, look at the top 8 instead. Put 2 in their hand, the rest on the bottom in a random order. So Farsight Ritual, it's just bad Memory Deluge. Like, Memory Deluge is a staple of Standard, and there is some upside to Farsight Ritual. Like, if you bargain it, you get to go 8 cards deep instead of 4, so if you bargain it, the first copy is better than Memory Deluge, but the decks that want Memory Deluge really like the flashback. If you ever see the decks that play it, it's the control decks, and they cast in the early game, find some stuff, later in the game, flash it back. The flashback makes it feel almost unbeatable sometimes, just the steady source of card advantage the control deck is to generate. Farsight Ritual, going deeper with the 1 copy you get, just isn't going to be worth it in the decks that would want this effect, so I think until Memory Deluge rotates, this is just worse Memory Deluge, although there is one exception. So I don't think it really applies to Standard, but there are decks where sacking an artifact or an enchantment is actually a really, really huge upside. So maybe you have a 1 ring that's going to kill you. You can use Farsight Ritual to just get it off the battlefield. Maybe you're playing Demonic Pact and things go wrong and you don't find the Harmless Offering to give it to your opponent and you're about to die to it. Farsight Ritual lets you get it off the battlefield. So I think in like 99% of decks, or maybe 99.9% of decks, Farsight Ritual is just mad Memory Deluge, but in that 0.1% of decks, it's actually going to be really good. We also got Specter of Mortality. So Specter of Mortality, 5 mana 3/3 flyer. When it enters the battlefield, you can exile 1 or more creature cards from your graveyard. When you do, each other creature gets -X until end of turn, where X is the number of cards exiled this way. So at first glance, Specter of Mortality kind of calls back to like Massacre Girl or Massacre Worm, and I think it serves a similar purpose, although you gotta jump through some hoops to actually make it work. Massacre Girl often just wrath the board. Massacre Worm, always -2/-2, but you get a bigger body and some damage out of it. Specter of Mortality can do a similar thing, but you gotta have a graveyard full of creatures. So I'm a little bit worried that when Corpse Explosion came out in Streets of New Capenna, I was really high on that card as a wrath that you just exile a thing from your graveyard and get them. Turns out it wasn't actually very good. Specter of Mortality might be similar. It seems like it's gonna be tricky to turn this into a hard wrath, because let's say there's a 5 toughness creature on the battlefield. Are you really going to have 5 creatures in your graveyard to exile? Probably not very consistently unless you're really, really built around it. So the good news about Specter is it is in the best color in Standard. If you look at Standard right now, black is still the best. So this fits into the same decks as Gix and Shieldred and all these other really, really strong black cards. Will it make it in the main deck of the black decks? In the current meta, I would say no. I think the power of Specter is going to be in very specific matchups, which we'll talk about in a minute. And the current black decks, they're not really based on filling their graveyard. And some of the cards that do get in the graveyard, like Razor Lash Transmogrant, Tenacious Underdog, you kind of don't want to exile because you want them in there to get them back later. Plus, Graveyard Trespasser is really popular right now, and it eats away your graveyard. So all this to say, don't think of Specter of Mortality as a Wrath. It's going to be very difficult for this to come down and just Wrath the entire board every time in most decks. On the other hand, I think there are certain decks in certain matchups where this card could be a bob. So the first one I thought of is the fabled Old Stick Fingers Urborg Lurgoyf Graveyard deck. Every spoiler season I talk about this deck. Every time the set drops, I build the deck. Every time it fails horribly. But maybe this is the time. We have the pieces. We have the pieces to get a ton of creatures in our graveyard. And if you can consistently fill your graveyard with creatures, Specter of Mortality is actually kind of exciting. 5-mana Hard Wrath that leaves behind a 3/3. Plus, you can kind of control it and maybe keep some of your creatures. Yeah, it's a little awkward that you're exiling creatures that's shrinking your Old Stick Fingers or Urborg Lurgoyf. But still, in those decks, it could be really good. The other places could be really good is in those just top tier black decks as a sideboard card for specific matchups. So as I said before, I don't think it's really realistic in most decks for this to come down and be a Hard Wrath. You're just not going to have enough creatures in your graveyard that you want to exile for this to be blowing up the Adalines and Titan of Industries of the world. On the other hand, against some decks, you don't need to be exiling 5 creatures for this to be good. Maybe you're up against a token style deck. Maybe you're up against a mono red deck. Just exiling a couple of creatures from the graveyard is probably going to wipe out your opponent's entire board and leave behind your board and the Specter of Mortality, which is probably just a game-ending line. So I think that Specter of Mortality, this card definitely has homes. This is a high-power card. It's just not a Hard Wrath on a card. It's a card that is for graveyard-based decks and also for the token go-wide aggro-style matchups, where this is going to be a legit bomb. So I think in Standard, my guess is in the current meta, it's probably a sideboard card, maybe a one-of main deck card, but that could certainly shift in the future. And if you're playing a graveyard deck in Commander, where you have a bunch of creatures that you don't mind exiling and you're like an aggressive self-mill deck, this could be one of your wraths in that deck as well. We also got a couple of rares that just kind of slipped through the cracks yesterday. We had so many spoilers, I missed these two, including the Goose Mother Hong Kong, a Simic and X 2/2 Flying Bird Hydra. It's a legendary creature. It enters a battlefield with X+1/+1 counters. When it enters the battlefield, you create half X food tokens rounded up, and then when it attacks, you can sack a food. If you do, draw a card. So the Goose Mother, it scales pretty nicely. It's a 2-mana 2/2 flyer, but also a 10-mana 10/10 flyer. And the rounding up of the food tokens is also pretty beneficial. It means if you cast it for 3 mana, you're going to get a food token out of it, which is a nice little bonus, and then that eventually turns into cards. I'm curious how good this card will actually be. It's definitely an interesting design. The mother of the Gilded Goose, perhaps. As far as power level, it looks like Hydroid Crosses, but I think it's actually like a lot worse. Hydroid Crosses just did all the stuff right away. The Goose Mother, the thing it does right away is make some food, which is nice, but to start drawing the cards, you need to be able to attack. If you can keep the Goose Mother on the battlefield and attack with it a few times, it kind of turns into a Hydroid Crosses, but I don't think it's anywhere near the power of Hydroid Crosses, which is maybe good because Crosses was very strong back when it was in Standard. I think that we do have a bunch of reasons to make food. We have like Sir Ginger that wants artifacts going in the graveyard. We have the bargain mechanic, which is really, really powerful and just wants random tokens on the battlefield to sacrifice. So there are reasons to make food tokens in Standard. Plus, we could have a dedicated food deck. This could be a piece of some of the ramp decks that have been floating around. I don't think you'd play a lot of them, but I like the flexibility. If you look at a ramp deck that's using like Topiary Stomper, Invasion as end card, or Ramp into Atrox and Hullbreak Horror, your big finishers are always super expensive. And there's a risk that if you don't hit your ramp, they just get stuck in your hand and you get run over. The nice thing about the Goose Mother is in the early game, you can run it out as a 3-mana 3/3 that makes a food and maybe draws a card, or a 4-mana 4/4 that makes a food and maybe draws a card. If you don't have your ramp spells, and then if you do ramp, in the late game, this can be a 10-mana 10/10, a 12-mana 12/12 that makes a ton of food. So I don't think you'll be playing 4 copies of it or anything, but I could certainly see playing a copy or 2 in some of the ramp decks in Standard. So Goose Mother, I mean, it's a Bird Hydra. How can you complain about this card? Good for food decks, maybe good in ramp decks, but we'll have to wait and see. We also got Elvish Archivist, a 2-mana 0/1 Elf Artificer that says whenever one or more artifacts enter the battlefield under your control, put 2 +1/+1 counters on it, but only once each turn. And whenever one or more enchantments enter the battlefield under your control, draw a card, but this triggers only once each turn. So Elvish Archivist is a strange card, because to really maximize its power, you need artifacts and enchantments entering the battlefield, although maybe it's strong enough if you only use one of them. The first thing I thought of when I saw this is this could be really good in the Teething Wormlet deck. Ever since Teething Wormlet came out, I've wanted to make some sort of green-based artifact aggro deck, because Teething Wormlet gets really big as a 1-drop. It's a very powerful 1-drop if you can have artifacts entering the battlefield. Elvish Archivist is kind of similar. You like play your Wormlet, you play your Archivist, and then you play your whatever, Haywire Might, and you're getting a bunch of counters on things, gaining life, growing your stuff. Plus, we have some good green artifact creatures like Rootwire Amalgam, Haywire Might, Simian Simulacrum. So I want to revisit the possibility of a green-based artifact deck. With Elvish Archivist being one of the key 2-drops in the deck, it does start off slow, like a 2-mana 0/1, not good on turn 2. Like, you're not going to play this and block whatever your opponent played. On the other hand, the next turn it becomes a 2/3, which is like, okay, and then the next turn it becomes a 4/5, which is good, and if it sticks around past that, it can just keep scaling throughout the game. So it starts off slow, but the power does grow exponentially as the turns go by. The enchantment mode I'm a little bit less excited about. Like, the best enchantresses don't have the once per turn restriction. If you think about Enchantress decks, they often want to have these big combo turns where you get stuff set up and then you like play 5 enchantments, draw 5 cards, have this huge turn. Elvish Archivist is never gonna do that, although getting a little bit extra value out of it is nice. It does work with the role enchantments that are coming to standard, so maybe there's some sort of enchantment deck that could play it in like Pioneer, maybe in standard, although I'm pretty skeptical that, you know, your Calyx Destiny's Hand deck or Hallowed Haunting deck is going to want an enchantress that only draws once each turn. Obviously, the dream is you somehow build a deck that cares about artifacts and enchantments. This was like kind of a supported theme in Kamigawa, so like Banishing Slash, Roadside Reliquary, Assassin's Ink, Machiko's Reign of Truth, those cards still exist in standard, and they also reward you for having artifacts and enchantments, although we've never really seen a huge payoff for this. It's not like there's some bomby mythic that's like, play artifacts and enchantments and I'm going to win you the game. It's all these random like removal spells and utility spells, so I don't know if there's actually enough incentive to try to build a deck around both sides of Archivist, so I think it's an interesting card. My guess is it'll be at its best with the artifact mode in that green-based artifact deck where it can grow throughout the game and become a really big threat, but you could get some value out of the enchantment mode as well, and maybe there's a deck that can take advantage of both, which would be the dream scenario for Archivist. We also got a ton of lower rarity stuff that's gonna fill out the limited format, maybe show up in some fringe decks in standard, so you can check out all of it over at MTGpreviews.com. Our one meaningful reprint of the day of Evolving Wilds, which, good and limited, occasionally sees some fringe standard play, but not super exciting by 2023 standards. Finally today, we got some more of the Enchanted Tales. So I broke these down in 3 different groups. This group is cards coming to Magic Arena for the first time that'll be legal in Historic Brawl. The top left one is Fraying Sanity, basically Burvac, doubling up your mill. And some of these cards are pretty interesting. Intruder Alarm, lots of weird combos. That'll be sweet to have on Arena. Mana Flare could work in a Storm-style combo deck. Grave Pack, probably mostly for Historic Brawl, but you'll definitely see people complaining about getting their board wrath repeatedly against a sacrifice deck. So some interesting new options for Historic and Historic Brawl at Arena. We also got a bunch of cards that are already on Arena, and honestly, this group is mostly the Enchanted Tales you don't want to open. They're random commons, there's some rares in there, but not really high value stuff. But still, the art is sweet, and it's always cool to see these special slots. It's a nice little bonus that rewards you for opening pack to get a card that just looks really neat and potentially is powerful or valuable. Finally, we have Spreading Seas. And Spreading Seas is kind of mind-blowing. So it's, if you don't know Spreading Seas somehow, it's just 2 mana enchantment, enchant a land, The land is an island, draw a card. When Wizards announced these cards, there were 6 of them that are going to be banned in Historic. They had like Blood Moon and Necropotence, which that makes sense. As much as I wanted Blood Moon just to like teach some Arena Zoomers about not playing Magic, I can understand why they'd ban that. I can understand why you can't have Necro just like drawing 20 cards or whatever, comboing off. But Spreading Seas is on the Historic ban list. This card is literally pre-banned in Historic, and it kind of blows my mind. I'm really not sure why, in a world of the One Ring and Orcish Bowmasters and Crucius going on nerf for a year and just like the ridiculousness that is the Historic format, why is Spreading Seas getting pre-banned? And I'm very curious. I want to bring this up not only to rant about it, but also to get your opinions. Why? Why would this card, of all cards, be considered too good and pre-bannable in a format as ridiculous and as powerful as Historic? My theory is this. I've heard some people speculating that it's the land destruction thing, like, oh no, you put your Spreading Seas on my land and it's an island. No, I can't imagine that's true. Even in 2023, where Wizards hates land destruction, that can't be that this turns a land into an island. There's no way. Cleansing Wildfire is legal. Stone Rain's legal. There's no way that that's the argument. My theory is this. My theory is Wizards handed out Merfolk decks as one of the new player decks on Arena, and Spreading Seas, the main way it sees play, is in Merfolk decks to give your opponent an island, to turn on your island Walk Lords, to make your team unblockable, and just kill your opponent in 1 or 2 attacks. My thinking, and maybe this is totally off base, is Wizards was afraid that this would show up in like low rank play, unranked play with the free Merfolk decks that they handed out to players and just wreck people, new players who maybe don't know you should play a bunch of removal or you're going to get wrecked by things like this. And that would make people just quit the game and stop playing Arena when their Merfolk opponent plays a Spreading Seas and all of a sudden all their team's unblockable and they die and then they just shut down Arena and go play Marvel Snap or whatever. That's my theory, is it's not so much that it's land destruction, or it's not even land destruction, land disruption, I guess, if you even want to call it that. But my guess is they were afraid of Island Walk Merfolk Lords. But I'm curious, what do you think? Why in the world is Spreading Seas banned on Arena? This is a new one for the list of weirdest bannings we've ever seen, because out of all the cards, I would not have expected Spreading Seas to be the one getting the ban hammer. But anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Wilds of Eldraine spoilers for today. So let me know what you think. We saw a ton of cards today. What are you hyped for? What are you building? Let me know in the comments. And I'll be back tomorrow with more daily Wilds of Eldraine spoilers. So until then, everyone, have a great day, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more magic? Well, make sure to check out yesterday's daily spoiler video here, or maybe the one about the most expensive card from every single year of Magic the Gathering.